Welcome to Wider View, the program that provides perspectives on the news outside the narrow confines of the mainstream media. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. If you managed to read past the stories about Biden, Sanders, and the race for the White House, you may have noticed that the war against Syria is still going on. In fact, we're coming up on the 9-year anniversary of the unrest that gave rise to the war. And for most of that time, the U.S. and its NATO ally Turkey were working together to arm, train, and supply al-Qaeda and other terrorist groups trying to overthrow the legitimate Syrian government. But that situation changed dramatically in the fall of 2015 when Russia began supporting the Syrian Arab Army in its war against the terrorists. Fast forward to September 2018, and the leaders of Russia and Turkey sat down in Sochi and signed an agreement designed to end the conflict, but that agreement broke down. And in the last few weeks, we have seen Turkish and Russian troops facing off in northern Syria. And yesterday, the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in Moscow. So I've asked Moscow-based analyst Mark Sleboda to come back and provide an update on the situation. Welcome back, Mark.
Charles, thanks for having me. It's always an honor and a pleasure to be on A Wider View.
So maybe we should start by talking about Turkey's recent invasion of Syria, and why did Erdogan take this step, and what was he hoping to gain?
Yeah, so I think we should start big picture, because you're right, this conflict has gone on for 9 years now, right? Mm-hmm. It is a tremendously long conflict. This conflict started out as an Islamist rebellion against the authoritarian but secular, multi-confessional, and multi-ethnic Syrian Arab Republic. So now the war has morphed again with this three-way standoff. You had Turkey assumed responsibility for backing all of the 31 flavors of jihad and Islamists that had previously been backed by the U.S., the U.K., France, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Israel, etc., etc. Turkey took responsibility for them. And Turkey created two overarching groups, the so-called Syrian National Army and the National Liberation Front. They've kind of combined them all into these two large proxy forces that Turkey keeps still largely in Turkish-occupied Syria, northern Syria, in the Jarablus corridor and Afrin area, and the other area that they seized away from the U.S.-backed Kurds in the east of Syria, east of the Euphrates River. The U.S. retreated before the Turks in an attempt to avoid conflict with them. And that operation was also limited by Russia and the Syrian government negotiating with the Kurds, who still have one foot in bed with the United States and the other foot in bed with Russia and the Syrian government. But they limited Erdogan's incursion in the northeast to an area of Sunni Muslim majority for the most part. But the U.S. retreated south to Syria's oil fields, and with Donald Trump quite loudly bragging in what is an obvious war crime that the U.S. is there for Syria's oil and they are occupying Syria's oil. Exactly how they can get rid of it in any large scale isn't exactly clear, but at the very least they can deny it to the Syrian government for reconstruction and rebuilding the country. The conflict has now morphed once again, with the U.S. kind of sidelined in East Syria, sitting on the oil and not doing much else. The war has now morphed into a contest between Syria, Russia, and Iran on one side, and Turkey and the jihadists on the other. And it has really become, for Turkey at least, a war of neo-Ottoman conquest and influence. And Erdogan is increasingly speaking of particularly Idlib, but the other areas of northern Syria. When he speaks to his own people, his own domestic base, he speaks in Turkish. He's speaking to them in neo-Ottoman terms of lands and peoples that are part of a greater Turkey, part of the Ottoman Empire, and should be again. And he just recently invoked the word watan, with reference to Idlib, that Idlib is a rightful part of the Turkish homeland. And actually, he's doing the same thing in Libya, in that conflict there, where Russia and Turkey are also on different sides. But that we'll save that one for another day. Recently, with Turkey not fulfilling deals that they made under the Sochi memorandum a year and a half ago with regards to a ceasefire in Idlib. They had agreed to drive al-Qaeda and the other al-Qaeda, also known as Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. Even the U.S. government recognizes that they're simply al-Qaeda rebranded in an attempt to avoid targeting, as they have several times during this conflict, and that they are a terrorist organization, recognized by the U.S., by the U.K., by Russia, by the United Nations, and even, however grudgingly, by Turkey, not that it stops them from supporting them. Turkey was supposed to remove al-Qaeda and the other extremists from a demilitarized zone around Idlib to prevent conflict. They were supposed to remove heavy weapons from their own more immediate proxies in the National Liberation Front and the Syrian National Army. They were to open the M4 and M5 highway in cooperation with Russia to civilian traffic, so the economy of Syria could begin to recover. And they were to start to dismantle the proxy government structures or had been set up with their help in Idlib by al-Qaeda. And they have done none of those. In fact, they've done the exact opposite, and they literally support al-Qaeda. There was a conflict a little over a year ago. Idlib was once about 60% owned by al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. But they drove out the rest of Turkey's other proxies in the National Liberation Front and so on. They drove them out of Idlib, or they subsumed willing units into their own in kind of a power play. And that's one constant that has really helped the Syrian government and Russia in this lengthy conflict until now, is the jihadists and Islamists have always fought and squabbled amongst each other, often more for reasons of simple who's the biggest dog and what resources and what sponsors they have and what rents they can get from what territory they control. You know, they actually put taxes on the trafficking of goods and ammunition and so forth. Al-Qaeda came to control essentially 90% of Idlib. And the rest of Idlib that's not controlled by them is controlled by groups that are completely subservient to al-Qaeda. And those groups are the Turkestan Islamic Party and Jund al-Aqsa. These are two groups of international jihadists, mostly Chinese Uyghurs and Central Asians from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, and elsewhere, and they control a bit of Western Idlib. But again, they owe fealty to Giuliani. They owe fealty to al-Qaeda. And the other group is Haras al-Din, which is really just a subset within al-Qaeda more than anything else. They're essentially al-Qaeda squared. They're the harder than hardcore al-Qaeda, if that gives you an indication.
I mean, the only thing we hear in the mainstream media over here is that the Russians and the Syrian army are bombing schools and hospitals and killing civilians who are being carried on stretchers by the white helmets.
Yeah, Putin personally targeting stray kitten shelters and so on.
I mean, that's and we're talking about really are trying to get back land from these militant groups so that civilians can live in peace.
Yeah, it's really amazing because it was a little under 2 years ago where the Western mainstream media across the board, New York Times, Washington Post, everyone admitted, however unhappily, that Idlib was now completely controlled by al-Qaeda. They admitted it. Right. And they said, oh, well, this is kind of the end. And then they were looking at Duma as kind of the last stronghold, because after that, there's just, jihadists left, as if the people in Duma weren't also jihadists. But then when these Turkish proxies, even the more under control ones. Al Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, is more really of an uneasy ally with Turkey rather than a direct proxy. Turkey doesn't have complete control over them, although they do have a lot of leverage because they continually supply Al-Qaeda controlled Idlib every day with convoys of gasoline, food, supplies, ammunition, weapons, right? That makes Turkey, of course, a direct state sponsor of terror, which the Russian military just alluded to earlier this week. But when Turkey's more direct control of proxies, the National Liberation Front and the Syrian National Army, when they were attacking the Kurds, the U.S.-backed Kurds in eastern Syria a few months ago, the media was full of stories of their brutalities, of the war crimes they were committing and everything. And then fast forward a few months when we've got the same and worse jihadists in Idlib, and suddenly it's a rebel bastion and a rebel stronghold once again. And there's never any mention. You can go through entire articles where they never even mention that it is literally Al-Qaeda, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Idlib and the others. Or if they do, it's buried as a one-line sentence in the 17th paragraph.
Exactly. There are two things that I want to make sure that we cover today. First is the U.S. role. I mean, we had U.S. Special Representative James Jeffrey earlier in the week offering to provide ammunition to Turkey, and
that is something the U.S. already does. Right. So it's really a way of claiming that the U.S. will help by not doing anything.
Right. And then we had the U.S. ambassador to the UN actually smuggled into Syria in a group controlled by the Islamic terrorists, meeting with the White Helmets. We have Lindsey Graham calling for a no-fly zone over Idlib and so forth. I mean, this kind of sounds like to me like a dying empire trying to remain relevant rather than actually accomplishing anything.
Yeah, these are a few neocons at this point, and the Dutch foreign minister, for some reason, also calling for a no-fly zone at this point. The U.S. is not playing a direct role in Idlib, and NATO has made perfectly clear that despite Turkish troops coming under fire and being killed in Idlib, officially the word is that at least from the Turks and the Russian side, that it was Syrian government artillery. But the reality seems to be that it was actually a Russian airstrike meant to punish Erdogan for handing out man pads to Al-Qaeda. I mean, what could go wrong? Handing out man pads to terrorists, right? And there were at least 5 shots during the 24 hours previous to what seems to have been a Russian airstrike on a Turkish convoy in Idlib in Syria. A very punishing airstrike that it seems took out the first and the last vehicles, the military vehicles in the convoy, and then continued to strafe them. And then when the Turkish troops retreated to some nearby buildings, dropped a bunker buster bomb on top of the buildings, right? And this was a serious message. You've gone too far, handing out man pads that shoot at our aircraft to terrorists. You know, that's something that you have to be punished for.
Right. It seems that the meeting yesterday in Moscow, it sounded from what I'm reading as though Putin pretty much told Erdogan, that you better stop and, these are the limits. Is that how you read it?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we have to say that the U.S. is cheerleading very strongly for Russia and Turkey to go to war with each other. That's what the U.S. role is at this point, saying, go to it, guys, go to it, go at each other, right? Because it's a 3-way standoff at this point. That's what every side wants, is to see the other two sides go to war. Russia and the Syrian government have made some serious advances in Idlib in the past 2 months towards securing the M5, which they've now secured, and they want to secure the M4 highways. The M5 is diagonal across Idlib, and that runs from Aleppo to Damascus, Syria's 2 biggest cities. They're industrial with their political and financial center. And the M4 runs from Aleppo to the the coastal, heavily populated Latakia province. And control of these two highways is absolutely necessary for the economic recovery of the country and for maintaining its territorial integrity. Turkey was supposed to secure these for civilian traffic months ago. They failed to do. So the Syrian government and Russia pushed hard in Idlib against Al-Qaeda-controlled territory once again, and they recovered some crucial territory, including all of the M5. And that's when Erdogan went a little bit apoplectic, and he sent some 10,000 troops, thousands of pieces of military gear to back up Al-Qaeda, and that's when some direct warfare started between the Turks and the Syrian government for the first time in this conflict. And, at least some fighting that involved Russia and Turkey, although both sides continually tried to deny it, because neither side wants to go to war with each other. That's important for understanding. Right. Russia and Turkey are happy killing each other's proxies, and with their proxies killing the other side, but they're trying very hard to avoid direct war where they're killing each other because of the consequences that would have on their economic relations, geopolitically, and so forth. So with Russia re-entering the fray after the strike that killed some 30 to 100 Turkish troops, Russia allowed him, it seems, a couple days to vent and conduct some drone strikes, mainly so that he could have some type of face saving for his Islamist and nationalist political base. Then Russia re-entered the fray with the electronic warfare, the air defense, and their own air force, and quickly took all that territory back. And they went into the ceasefire talks on March 5th under those conditions, with Erdogan's proxies effectively being defeated heavily in the field and Turkish drone support decimated. So the terms of this ceasefire, quote ceasefire, unquote, it's called the Moscow Memorandum. First of all, it's not a ceasefire. No, it's as worthless as a ceasefire as every other ceasefire, whether it's between the U.S. and Russia, between Russia and Turkey, or anyone else in this conflict, because of the elephant in the room. Idlib is controlled by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda is supported by Turkey, but Turkey doesn't claim to have control over them, and indeed it could be said they don't have complete control over them. And Al-Qaeda is not a party to these memorandum. They are not even mentioned in the memorandum, and they have already released a statement saying that they will not abide by it, and they will continue attacks against the Syrian government in Russia, which they do every day. They attack south, west, and east. They never attack north, of course, into Turkey. That's why the Syrian government can't just let them sit there. This conflict is urban warfare against an entrenched jihadi foe with some degree of support among the population there. It's a horrible conflict. There is collateral damage. There is destruction of buildings and infrastructure. There is mass displacement. But this is absolutely no different than what the U.S. did in Fallujah multiple times, Mosul, Raqqa, where they weren't even invited, Kobani, etc. And when there are still hundreds of thousands of displaced from U.S. military operations in Syria and in western Iraq. Why? Because they leveled those cities. I mean, read the reports. There was mass civilian casualties. There was mass displacement. There was mass bombing and destruction. But somehow when Russia and the Syrian government does it, of course, according to Al-Qaeda, witnesses out of Al-Qaeda controlled territory, Russia is only targeting hospitals because Al-Qaeda is well known for their charitable construction of hospitals for civilians in the territory they control. This is all nonsense. It's demonization and it's political. And I'm not castigating the U.S. effort in Iraq or in eastern Syria to get rid of ISIS. But it's the same thing with Russia and the Syrian government. You can't let al-Qaeda sit there. This is not the largest concentration of al-Qaeda since 9/11, as some U.S. generals have pointed out. It is the largest al-Qaeda concentration of al-Qaeda ever. There are tens of thousands between al-Qaeda and their allies with the Turkestan Islamic Party and Haras al-Din. There is close to some 50,000 fighters there alone, not even mentioning Turkey's other proxies and Turkish troops in the territory. That is far more al-Qaeda than there were in Afghanistan when the U.S. invaded and occupied Afghanistan back in 2001. They attack every day. You can't just let them sit there. They're a threat to Syria, Syrian civilians outside that zone, Syrian civilians in the area they occupy, but they're also a terrorist threat to the world. And they are training, indoctrinating the young people in the area they control, where there is no other work except to fight for them, of course, and they essentially draft everyone into their fighting. So, yeah, there's civilian damage, there's collateral damage, there's displacement, but that's the reality. If you wanted to avoid that, then don't start a proxy war using jihadists as proxies against the country.
Exactly. I mean, that seems like, these people would have been defeated long ago. Were they not useful to the U.S., to other groups, and other national groups?
Would not have a refugee problem today, right? Certainly of the scale it does, with 3 to 4 million Syrian refugees that were fleeing out of a direct conflict zone to anywhere that's safe, because Turkey is continuing this proxy war and keeping these people fighting and keeping them controlling territory, right? It's the exact same thing for Turkey, with armed Kurds in East Syria acting as U.S. proxies. They wouldn't be there if Turkey hadn't been cooperating with the U.S. in a proxy war, creating a power vacuum in eastern Syria, where the Kurds had to arm themselves to protect themselves. These are all self-inflicted wounds of Erdogan's foreign policy, of blatant aggression, proxy war, now overt occupation and attacks on Syria. So I have no sympathy.
The other thing, though, that I think we need to be in the West frightened about is that once these groups are defeated, which is inevitable, all these foreign fighters that came from Western Europe and the U.S. and all these other places around the world are going to go back.
Well, some of them will try to go back to the U.S. and West, but it's even bigger problem for Turkey, because they will be very angry at him when they lose and he stops paying their salaries. And that's a big domestic threat that he is well aware of. I mean, he's got tens of thousands of them. He intends to carve out a protectorate of northern Syria that he can attempt to force back the Syrian government in Damascus to accept under some type of weak federalization, where they have their own armed forces, they have their own structures, and on paper they're part of Syria, but in reality they owe fealty to Istanbul and the Sultan there, Erdogan, rather than to Assad. That's what he thinks he can get out of it at this point. Yeah. He thinks large parts of Syria belong to him. The ceasefire, it will be a temporary ceasefire between Russia and Turkey. But inevitably, al-Qaeda will attack. And the Russian and the Syrian government will respond. Al-Qaeda is not a party to the talks, but nonetheless, Turkey and the Western press will proclaim that Russia and the Syrian government violated the ceasefire. They never ever report attacks on Syrian territory, Syrian government territory, and the ceasefire will fall apart then. But this is good, because the memorandum agreed to was basically, it was a face-saving way for Erdogan to surrender territory in Idlib, to surrender about half the territory. The M5 highway is now controlled by the Syrian government. That's not in question. The M4 highway will have a supposed safety buffer zone, a demilitarized zone, 6 kilometers north and south, and that highway will supposedly be patrolled starting in 2 weeks by Russian and Turkish troops. Of course, that is not going to work out, because there are still large numbers of jihadists and Islamists, principally Al-Qaeda, south of that highway. That Turkey is basically abandoning at this point, but who are not going to give up their arms. They're not going to give up. Some of them may try to escape into Turkish-controlled territory. Others will fight on. There's a city at the end of the M4 highway, a small city, Jisr al-Shagur. And Jisr al-Shagur is controlled by the Turkestan Islamic Party and Jund al-Aqsa, these Central Asian jihadists and Chinese Uyghurs. They are a nasty bunch, and there's no way they're going to give up control of that city. Who's going to force them out? Right, to open up the M4 highway. The M4 highway runs right through that city. Is Turkey going to get them out? No. Are they going to willingly retreat? No. Is Russia and the Syrian government going to be forced to get them out? Yes. And then in order to fulfill the terms of the memorandum they've just signed, that will renew conflict. Even though, of course, the Turkestan Islamic Party and their al-Qaeda allies are not party to the conflict, Turkey and the West will claim that Russia and Syria are attacking civilians again and so on. And, we'll go back into this conflict. Right. But it will give both sides a chance to consolidate in Turkish and al-Qaeda territory what they have left and to retrench in, create new fortifications and underground tunnels and so forth. But it will allow the Syrian government in Russia to reopen these two highways and to consolidate the territory they've taken. And they've got serious help now, because when Erdogan attacked in Idlib in the past 2 weeks, his own troops actually attacked and killed Hezbollah forces that were fighting alongside the Syrian government and Iranian officers as well. Man, you just don't make enemies out of Hezbollah if you don't have to. They are battle-hardened. Whatever you may think of them, that was just stupid. He didn't have to do that. Hezbollah would have been happy killing his proxies. But now Hezbollah has a grudge against Erdogan himself, and Iran is less than happy as well. So Turkey is not just facing the Syrian government at this point. They're not just facing a relatively small, if effective, Russian expeditionary force. They're also facing Iran and Hezbollah, and that's why Erdogan is giving up at least half of Idlib at this point. Yeah. Now, the conflict will resume in a few more months. It's inevitable, and it's highly likely. It's almost certain that Erdogan will fight to the last jihadi to keep his grips on Idlib, because if he loses Idlib, and I've talked to Turkish state pundits, they're afraid that of course the next logical step is to kick Turkey out of their other zones of occupation in northern Syria, the Jarablus corridor, Afrin Canton. The Kurds really want that back, and Russia is keeping them on the leash at this point. That area in East Syria as well. So this is a reprieve. This is a breather and a consolidation. But don't think it's a ceasefire.
I'm sure we're going to be able to have a discussion again in a few months about Syria and the evolving situation there. Mark, thanks very much for joining me and for giving us a little background on Syria.
Yeah, it's not over. We'll be talking about it again.
Thanks again to Mark Sleboda for joining me this week on Wider View. As always, the views expressed here are those of myself and my guests and may not reflect the views of the management of this radio station. I'm your host, Charles Dunaway. Thank you for listening to Wider View.